Alex is my colleague from the IGF, yeah.
Okay, I guess I think we just a quick setup. One of the attendees, Amjit, said he couldn't hear the mobile, so want to check if he's better now. Amjit, can you hear us? Okay, I think I'll do that later. Thank you very much, and you're all welcome.
Yeah, I guess it's time to begin now. The organizers and panelists can take lead.
Are we good to go? Oh.
Yes, we are good to go. We can begin. It's time.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our open forum, Safe Digital Spaces, a dialogue on countering cyberviolence. My name's Eve. I am the Gender Policy Officer at the Web Foundation. So I've had the opportunity to co-organize this session with Nandini from IT for Change and Helene from UN Women. I'm going to pass over to my co-organizers in a second, and then to Chennai, my colleague, who's going to be our moderator for the main panel. But first, I really want to quickly share a little bit about the Web Foundation's work around online gender-based violence, and tell you a little bit more about why we're so thrilled to be convening this discussion today. So the Web Foundation has three main approaches to our work on online gender-based violence. The first approach is research. Our research team conducts a broad range of research around women's access and experiences online. A lot of this is led by Chennai, who you'll hear from later, but we have a report coming out later next year that will look specifically at online gender-based violence. And we've recently published our annual Women's Rights Online report, which covers issues of access and privacy, as well as data rights. Our second approach is amplifying the work of grassroots women's and digital rights organizations through our Women's Rights Online initiative. The Women's Rights Online program is a research and advocacy network that aims to drive women's empowerment through the web. The network currently comprises of women's rights and digital rights groups from across 14 countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and they're working to bridge the gender gap on technology, data, and policymaking. And our third approach uses the evidence from our research as well as from the WRO network to co-create product and policy solutions. So we're currently running a series of consultations that, much like this panel, are bringing together tech companies and CSOs to host open dialogues with different stakeholders around countering online gender-based violence. And following from those consultations, the Web Foundation will host several policy design workshops to provide a space for civil society organizations and tech companies to co-create solutions to online gender-based violence using a human-centered approach. I'm about to put a link in the chat, which will give you a document that you can follow along from for the rest of the session. And on that document, you'll find links where you can learn more about the work of the Web Foundation as well as with our other co-organizers. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to my co-organizer, Nandini at IT for Change.
Hi, thank you, Eve, and hello everyone. And it's like nice to see you all today coming here to discuss this very urgent and burning issue, an issue that is as worrisome and bothersome and immediate as the US election, I would say. So now to begin with, IT for Change is an organization that works on research and policy advocacy at the intersections of digital technology, social justice, and gender equality in the global south. And we have been working with the Web Foundation's Women's Rights Online Network for a long time now. And we've also been working with UN Women for quite some time. So it's a pleasure to co-organize this with Web Foundation and UN Women. And I would just like to take a couple of minutes to just frame the reason why we wanted to have this conversation. So let's just start with today's context. So in the context of election day, it's just very important to remember how just about a month ago on October 2nd, Donald Trump contracted COVID-19. We all remember that, right? And within 24 hours of this, Twitter had announced, or rather reminded everybody that it would deplatform tweets that wish or hope for death, seriously bodily harm, or fatal disease against anyone. Of course, wishing bodily harm or death against anyone is problematic, and it is good that Twitter reiterated this policy in that context. But at the same time, a question rose in many people's minds, especially feminist organizations like us working in the global south and like most of us here, right? So there are numerous and billions of times when women, people of color, trans and non-binary people face rape and death threats and bodily harm on social media platforms every day. At that point, we know how we have to run pillar to post to get access to justice, right? So why is it that only in certain moments platform accountability is talked about? This is a question that bothers us time and again. And at the same time, when you look at what states are doing, all is not well there either. So in the country I come from, India, many of you may have heard of Kerala state, which is known to be very progressive and is famed for its gender and development model. At the same time, it's also very highly gender conservative. So just this month, Kerala state announced that it would pass an ordinance, which is not a law, but it will have a binding effect like a law, that to deal with what it calls cyberbullying, it would make it a cognizable offense, which means that whether or not a person is complaining, if the police force decides that certain messages are offensive, or they threaten harm or they insult reputation, that person can be picked up and put in jail for cyberbullying. And we all know where this goes because we have seen these instances time and time again. Every time we have the conversation on cyber violence, we keep getting stuck about platform accountability and the various difficulties. And I'm also cognizant and respectful of the fact that when we talk about social media governance, the sheer volume of content and the amount of content social media companies have to process, there is a very real challenge there because the public sphere is platformizing. We end up usually about trying to sort that out, or we are in the situation of when you look at national laws and nation states, how do you talk about free speech and ensuring freedom from harm for women without falling into the trap of state censorship? So I would like to really urge us all today in these reflections to think that maybe it's time for us to think of a new global constitutionalism for social media, where we are able to come outside just self-governance of platforms, which also has its own limitations because one is trying to interpret certain standards, and then those interpretations will be challenged and many different things will happen, and also completely relying on a national state level response, because as feminists we always know that states uphold the gender social contract, and this is not always like resulting in progressive results for women. And from the experience of our feminist foremothers, especially those who fought for a CEDAW, I think it's time to think of in the data age, what would it mean to have women's rights reclaimed again, and how do you address that and reground that in the context of reclaiming the cybersphere and completely abolishing sexism and misogyny online. And I think we have to talk at all these levels and cognizant of every actors and every position's challenges. And that's, I hope to learn from all of you and your experiences today, and I'm sure so does everyone at the table. And I look forward to an extremely insightful conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nandini. Helen?
Thank you, Eve. Thank you, Nandini. And I think my first words are going to be words of thanks to you both for championing these important topics. And I'm really thrilled to be here with you and trying to identify concrete solutions. I think I'm going to say a few words about the multilateral context and building up what Nandini has just said. Looking backwards, looking 25 years ago, we were at the fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing. And at the time we had 50,000 people streaming to Beijing. I think something that will never happen ever again, to have such big conference, whether or not we're talking about COVID times or I think being respectful of the climate. But here that we were making historical commitments on gender equality. And at the time, internet was almost absent from the discussions. There was no social media. Google hadn't been created. And you fast forward to today, and now we are in a space where we have the UN Secretary General who's actually saying that technology and innovations are one of the 5 priorities for gender equality. And if we achieve results in this area, we're gonna be transforming the world. So today our society are shaped by technology, and the internet is shaping gender relations across the world much more than we think. And at the time in Beijing, we thought that the internet would give the opportunity to every woman and girl to explore new forms of self or have more autonomy. But what we see today is actually when they go on social media, when they use the internet, it's augmenting the sexual stereotypes. it's intensifying surveillance, whether it's surveillance from their family, from their peers, or from complete strangers. And we see that happening all over the planet. It's a common phenomenon. So at UN Women, I think we think that changing this trend is the responsibility of everyone, government, businesses, civil society. And this is why we want to champion 2 multi-stakeholder initiatives to forge new partnerships on these issues. And firstly, it's one that many of you know, it's the Secretary General Digital Cooperation Roadmap. And it's really a call for collective action to ensure that digital inclusion is a reality for all, and especially for the most vulnerable. And the second one is the Generation Equality Forum that will take place next year in Mexico and Paris. And as part of this initiative, we are launching an action coalition on technology and innovation for gender equality. And the objective is to address the gender digital divide, but also to increase the safety of digital spaces. And we believe that these 2 new partnerships and new gathering will be the occasion to discuss how we can change trends, how we can redesign our society, and how we can chart an agenda for concrete action. So I really look forward to our discussion today, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Helene. Thank you both for such powerful framing and introductions of the topic. I'm now going to pass it over to my colleague, Chennai Chair, who is our Research Manager of Gender and Data Rights, and will be the moderator for the panel. So, Chennai.
Thank you so much, Eve. And to start off, I just want to say to you, Helene and Nandini, for organizing this panel, a very much needed conversation at the Internet Governance Forum. So welcome to everyone who's on the call. And I hope if you have any questions, we'll save questions up until the end, but you can post them into the chat as we're going on, and we will be monitoring the chat. So for panelists for the session, I am joined by Bhavna Jha from IT for Change, who is a Senior Research Associate, Cindy Southworth, Head of Women's Safety at Facebook, Helen, who's already spoken, but Senior Manager for the Action Coalition on Technology and Innovation for Gender Equality at UN Women, Marwa Azamet, Policy Advocacy Coordinator at Association for Progressive Communication, Take Back the Tech, and Mariana Valente, Internet Lab Director. I'm very excited to have all of these amazing panelists to share their insights on the conversation. So to start off with, I will start with Bhavna. And as you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about your work, I would like for you to respond to this question. In what ways can feminist framings, for example, help us understand why the online space is unsafe, and how best can these framings be used in developing policy and regulation? Over to you, Bhavna.
Thank you, Chennai. Hi, everybody. I'm Bhavna. I'm a lawyer and a researcher at ID for Change, Bangalore, India. And I work at the intersection of technology, law, policy, and gender. And I'll just dive straight into this really thought-provoking question that you presented before me, because it's very close to the work that we've been trying to move closer to at ID for Change more recently. So and I'll step back a little bit, not too far back, but about 6 months ago in May 2020, both during lockdowns, we did some Google Trends analysis at ID for Change. And there was this incident in India where an Instagram group run by young boys found itself in hot water for objectifying women's bodies. Alongside a rise in search for the term feminist, we saw a 5,000% increase in the search for the terms fake feminist and feminazi. Looking through our cyber feminist glasses, it was apparent that misogyny, while always lurking in online public spaces, shows itself in the form of virally amplifying anti-feminist statements during moments of feminist political contestation. Essentially, it's a pushback against a woman's claim over digital space, delegitimizing women's first-order rights to public participation. Platform intermediaries' arbitrary application of what Nandini referred to, right, as what are effectively human rights norms, and the corresponding absence of any liability on them when user-reported sexist hate and violence is not taken down, permits this de facto censorship of women's voices. This is exacerbated further by the strange fact that in India, my research suggests that there are many existing criminal laws that are against sexist or sexual harassment that are applicable to acts that would broadly cover what's happening in cyberspaces, but they are defined as occurring in public spaces. And our case law survey suggests that misogyny is manifested in digital private spaces, WhatsApp chats and direct messages that dox and torment and violate. And Indian courts seem unable to understand how to protect the interests of the victims of harassment in such digital spaces. So, a feminist framework for law and policy reform, firstly, recognizes that it is not enough to respond to violence as targeted at a particular woman at an individual level, but sees it as a structural problem based on the enforcement of power and the delegitimization of women's agency. Secondly, it informs policy initiatives that not only are distinctions between online and offline spaces meaningless, they are harmful, and existing legal interpretations of public place no longer hold true in a digital world. A feminist review of laws must open its eyes to the reality of spatial fluidity and mutability in a post-digital society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bhavna. I was nodding my head with everything that you're talking about in terms of how we then look at these spaces from a feminist lens and what it means in terms of the trends when you take on that feminist perspective. So I'll actually then swiftly move on to Cindy, who's representing a platform, head of women's safety from Facebook, and also reflecting on these remarks. Cindy, my question to you is, can you actually give us can you give an example of a time when a CSO and CSO, civil society organizations, and Facebook have actually worked together specifically to address a particular aspect of online gender-based violence? What was the process and the outputs, and how can Facebook do this more widely with civil society organizations from mainly from the global south? So I think coming on from that sort of like collaborative perspective of how do we work together for in these platforms?
Thank you so much, Chennai. And I am just really honored to join you all today. I joined Facebook in July of 2020 as their new head of women's safety. And prior to that, I worked in the gender-based violence nonprofit NGO sector for the past 27 years. And so I'll start off by sharing an example that I know intimately well because it was with me in my previous life as a NGO. And then I'll talk about some more recent work that we've been doing in all parts of the globe. But at the National Network to End Domestic Violence, I founded the Safety Net Technology Project and techsafety.org. And one of the things that we brought to Facebook when we joined their safety advisory board in 2010 is we talked about how if technology is meant to be this great equalizer and opportunity for education and empowerment and economic opportunity, survivors of gender-based violence, specifically domestic violence, needed to be able to safely use Facebook and other technology platforms. And we know that abusers are using spyware to monitor, to surveil, to control, using it to harass, threaten, et cetera. And so back in 2014, we put together a very lengthy guide on a survivor's guide to using Facebook. And we walked through all the different privacy settings and things they might want to do, because there's sort of a myth out there that, well, if you're being harassed or threatened, is just block the person. Well, that doesn't work. If you actually need to keep an eye on your ex to see if they're escalating, because it's a way to do threat assessment and assess your own safety risk if you can see what your ex is saying about you. So blocking is not always the best feature for a victim of domestic violence. So we put together this very comprehensive guide. It was not only translated into other languages, but we work Facebook. I have to figure out which we I am today. So in my past life, I was we, the nonprofit, and now so Facebook worked with many CSOs and NGOs around the world to adapt the women's safety content, to contextualize it, to make sure it was culturally relevant. So even though the features that Facebook offers were the same, wanting to make sure that the women's safety content was adapted in Finland and India, in all parts of the world, to make sure that it was still relevant. So that's one example. Sort of fast forward to a more recent example, same concept is we partnered, Facebook partnered with an NGO in Palestine called Seven Amla, and they put together a really cool video that you can see on the Facebook Safety Center. And they walk through all different ways for women to be able to use Facebook's features and to know how to report if there is harassment, if they do experience hate, if they have bump into impersonating accounts, and it's under facebook.com/safety resources. And if you change your country to Palestine, it's in Arabic, but it's actually pretty easy to understand. And they're walking women through how to use this tool while we know misogyny offline and online is still something that women face worldwide. And so I could go on, but I want to make sure there's time for all of the presenters to speak, and I'll save some of my other comments for Q&A time.
Thank you so much, Cindy. I understand the navigating between who's we, but it's actually really insightful in terms of the guide that was developed. So I'm actually going to then piggyback that question and actually ask Marwa this question. Marwa, in your work as a policy advocacy coordinator with one of the biggest organizing civil society organizations, APC, in your work with diverse stakeholders within APC itself, what are some of the examples or strategies you've seen emerge from civil society in engaging towards ensuring women's safety online?
Thank you, Chennai, and I'm also very honored to be here today with this all women powered panel. And yeah, I mean, just a bit of background to everyone. So Take Back the Tech is a campaign that reclaims the internet and digital technologies to assert women's ownership of virtual traffics and dismantle online gender-based violence. So at Take Back the Tech, we strongly believe that technology should be reclaimed for pleasure, consent, to counter the online harm and set the tone for that killjoy conversation that targets those who perceive women as victims of their virtual experiences, while normalizing with the way technology has always been designed, governed, and deployed. I guess something we've really realized throughout all these years at Take Back the Tech, and it was really a breakthrough for us, is that cyber violence and cyber violence campaigns, specifically against women, they have a common strategy. They would often deploy personal attacks with political motives. So you would find that the issue of violence online is mostly a threat against freedom of expression, that bodily expression, that identity expression, that sexual expression. And so when highly emotive and value-laden content is being deployed against women and people of diverse genders and sexualities to undermine their right to expression online, I guess we're entering that phase where we're talking more about how to counter that speech online more than how to counter violence, because at the very end, violence is more weaponized to target that freedom of expression. And we've seen that specifically throughout the Arab uprisings, where civil society used the online space to create feminist networks and organize both offline and offline to resist the oppression and demand gender parity across all spheres of society. And one thing that really emerged throughout these uprisings, for instance, in Tunisia, where the civil society has hosted an emancipated cyber activism and thriving online communities, it was mainly due to its supposedly progressive status of gender equality. And so we've seen how they've been influencing the ways women reverberated feminist discourses, sometimes keeping a low profile, other times publicly calling out harassments and violence exercised by mobs and anti-gender movement members to silence feminist dissents. So you would find that these, that they have blogged, tweeted, recorded their experiences spanning digital platforms with multiple identities, transgressing representations, power dynamics, languages, and cultural affiliations. and articulating discursive revolutionary messages across the categories of Arab, women, feminism, conservatism. And that was truly, that was truly revolutionary to witness. And another milestone in civil society was in Sudan and South Sudan, where we've witnessed how the civil society emerged and organized really well, given the longstanding misogyny in the country's history. And so specifically, women's-led civil societies, they undertook significant online mobilization, igniting everyone regardless of their political affiliations. And so I guess right now, and it's very important to talk about the level and the layers of online behavior and how we can really position cyberviolence within the context of freedom of expression, freedom of mobilization, and freedom of association, so that we would not only tackle it as a violence, but also as a weapon against how other vulnerable communities try to speak their mind, basically. Over to you, Chennai.
Thank you so much, Mara. Those two examples that you mentioned are also quite reflective of the current hashtag protests that are happening right now and how feminists are really organizing within their spaces, but also in the light of like the misogyny existent in these countries. So I'm actually going to move on to Mariana, because in thinking about this documentation that is being done by feminists, my question to you is, how do we actually build evidence around online safety issues that allows for those who actually experience these issues to also shape the policy language and the research that's done? Because one of the most effective ways, of course, when speaking to policymakers is the big question comes back is, what's the evidence? How do we know what we know?
Thanks, Chennai, and I thank you all for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here among you. And I want to start answering this by providing an example of violence that's not exactly cyber violence, but it relates to ICTs. And I wanted to tell you a bit about the research we did on the use of ICT by domestic workers in the city of São Paulo, Brazil, just because I think it's an example to answer that. We employed action research, which is one of the methods for participatory research. And together with a group of 30 domestic workers, we developed the questions for a quantitative survey. And then we gathered again to analyze the results. And one of the results we got was that only 25% of the domestic workers, who are almost all women in Brazil, use the internet to find work or publicize their work. And 70% of them felt unsafe to do so. And one could think that this has to do with capacities and literacy, but when we analyze the results together, this group of women told us that it was not safe to find work online because they all had experiences, either personal or of people they knew, of people who were harassed in their workplace or were not paid when they found work online. So the incidents of violence they experienced conditioned their use of the internet. And if we were not developing this participatory research, we would probably have reached different conclusions. I'm using that example just to point out to three things, which I think are central to producing evidence on cyber violence against women and to being able to effectively communicate that and using that for concrete results for women's lives. The first of them is that we really need to take into account the multiplicity of experiences of women. And that encompasses not only intersectionality as a methodology, but in this context of the digital environment, I think it's really essential to highlight that this means that what intersects is different from place to place, right? And I'm glad that my colleague Marwa was bringing examples from different parts of the world before, because I think it's never enough to emphasize this. The second thing is multidisciplinarity. I think it can sound obvious, but it's not that obvious when we're developing research in this landscape, that knowledge from other areas rather than internet policy is really essential for the work that we're doing. And we should be building bridges and being more transversal in our research. For example, critical racial studies have a lot to add to discussions on hate speech against women online, for instance. And if we're only drawing from research and references from the internet policy space, I don't think we're going to be able to really shape the policy environment because we need those bridges to bring those messages more effectively and to really understand the whole landscape. And the third one is that methods must be participatory and inclusive to take people's realities into account, because otherwise, and I wanted to show that by the example that I brought, we can bring assumptions into the table which really add little to women's concrete lives. And we are going to have results which are less powerful in terms of convening for policy. I would have a lot more to say, but this is just to start. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Mariana. I think those are really a key illustration of that offline, online, it's not a binary, but it's a continuous experience. And so then I'll move on to our last panelist as we get ready for questions. So please get ready to ask questions. Helen, and touching on that experience that Mariana has talked about, my question to you is that it's been 25 years since the Beijing Declaration. So the online space has evolved in that period, but how can we actually use this declaration and others to advocate for safe spaces online, as well as hold governments accountable to actually ask them to put the necessary policy and regulations in place?
Thank you, Chennai. And you know, even though the context has obviously changed a lot since Beijing, the principles that were formulated at the time apply offline and online. The declaration says that human rights and women's rights should be protected. And it applies whether you are walking down the streets or whether you're on the internet. And I think some of the participants put some very interesting comments in the chat section about the continuum of violence online and offline. It's not two separate things, it's the same thing. And I think the major shift since Beijing and what we will see with the Generation Equality Forum next year is that it's not going to be only about government. We need to hold everyone accountable and everyone has a role to play. We need strong civil society. We need voices that echoes the challenges faced by women online. We need to be, I think, even more vocal about how women are being pushed back from online spaces, especially in developing countries. We need to use the forum as an open dialogue with social media companies, just like the one we are having today, but really to bring to the table the companies that are the most impacted by this phenomena, and make sure that they are addressing online gender-based violence as a corporate priority. Social media companies have all the data we need to better understand what triggers online attack, whether it's on women, but also on young girls and adolescents. And so they have to use the data to figure out how to better protect them. I mean, obviously it will be a space where we want government and law enforcement to get better out, where we need to see concrete actions, to see them prevent and punish breach of rights and illegal online activity. And obviously it also requires regulation focusing on transparency and accountability. But I think overall what we need to call for is check and balances for all behaviors, whether we are talking about companies, governments, or just an individual putting an offensive comment online.
Thank you so much, Helen. It's true, we actually have to hold everyone accountable, not just governments, because this is an issue that requires everyone to actively engage on it. So I'm gonna switch my view. Are there any questions? I do not want to become an extra panelist, but if there are any questions, then I can actually, so there are some that are coming up right now. We have a question from Ellen Walker. Ellen, would you be okay with actually asking your question live? Eve or Nandini can adjust the mic speaking for you to ask your question. Eve, are we okay on that?
Yeah, Ellen, you should be able to talk now.
Hey, hello. Can you hear me?
Hello, yes, we can hear you.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much for organizing this. It's been really informative, and it's such an important topic today, I think more than ever, as there becomes more and more space that people can occupy. It's so important that women take up that space equally and have all the options open to them to use that space for education, for employment, to better their economic situations, you know, for everything. So thank you all so much. So my question was, if there are any good practices that you particularly like or you'd like to highlight, if there are good examples where a company has improved its anti-cyber mobbing law or policy rather, and if there's a good practice of a government adopting a change for better anti-cyber mobbing laws. That was one question. And my second question is at the individual level, because I know, and people, I heard from the discussion that people have different ideas about how much sense it makes to engage at the individual level or not, rather at a policy level. And I think that's a very interesting discussion in itself. But when you do talk about at the individual level, are there, for example, you know, handouts that people can just easily share on, you know, actions to take, you know, that's one other part. And I just want to add also that what we work on, I'm with Rights Tech Women, and we work to combine human rights education with technology education. So we're trying to, we work to train girls on robotics and programming, but also train them about their rights at the same time. So it's kind of something exciting that we're doing. And I just want to share that. Hopefully we can increase the practice of educating people not only on technology, but on the rights that are attached to technology. So I hope that that can also be part of the efforts going forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ellen. So Eve, I think we're going to take a couple of questions and then the panelists can choose as they go to respond. So next we have Daphne Stevens. Her question is in the Q&A. So Daphne, you might want to just turn on your mic and ask this question. And then I'll go over to Madeline, Elizabeth, and then Tara.
Hi, can you hear me? Great.
Yes.
First of all, thank you so much for the interesting session. It's very interesting, and I feel like I learn a lot from it. I was wondering what individuals can do to participate more in stopping cyber violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Daphne. That was a very clear, straight to the point question. I'm going to ask Madeline to speak.
All right, just one second. Last name on that one, Madeline.
Sorry about that. Madeline Myatt.
All right, Madeline, you should be able to ask your question now. Do we have Madeline? Maybe not. Should we read that one out loud then?
Yeah. So her question, Madeline's question was, from your experience to the panelists, is there one national strategy which can be discussed as a positive example for a multi-stakeholder approach? I think that's a really important question in terms of thinking about these issues. Yep, so maybe we can answer these questions and then we can have another round from the Q&A. Panelists, you can pick whichever question you'd like to respond to. Anyone?
Okay, so I'll just fill that in and step up and take a stab at this. I'm not going to directly answer the question on best practices because I think we've got like so much built up, some amount of say, frustration about how much time it takes for a response to actually take place. For instance, since we are today talking about intersectionality, the fact that it took several years of campaigning for, bodies like Equality Lab to get caste to be added as a factor within the, within the Facebook's India policy. And it took them 3 years of campaigning to make that happen. And even though, and there's some strange phenomena where even though jati, which is the Hindi translation of the word caste, a Sanskrit translation of the word, it was already a part of the Hindi version of the policy. It wasn't present in the English version, and therefore it didn't present as an option for, reporting a comment or behavior on the platform. So I think one of the things that the fact that platforms are responding is great. We'd really like them to respond faster, to step up their game, especially in in the global south, wherein a large chunk of their user base exists. And I think there's a strong need for greater accountability and responsibility towards users in these areas. So that's what I have to say about best practices in terms of content moderation responses. As far as I think that's the only one that I want to take a response for. Someone else would like to join in for the other questions?
I think Marwa unmuted. Many people are unmuting now.
Yeah, I
can go after. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. No, I just want to jump in on that specific question around like content moderation. And I mean, I don't really have a best practice to cite right now, but I just want to point 3 important dimensions that are really and often overlooked. Is that first one, I guess questions around content moderation, they should be tackled in a way that is multifaceted, because it takes so many forms, but they should also be contextualized, because it's very context specific. And so we would find that these centralized and automated responses, they would often really entail so much bias towards communities in different contexts. But at the very same time, we would find that we would need to really mobilize this local expertise when it comes to anti-cyber mobbing policies. And so the best practice would be to hear from these women and to hear from these experiences, and to leverage these experiences for us to understand what can fit and what cannot be done, basically. Yeah, over to you.
Yeah, I think there's also interesting conversation going on in the chat in terms of good examples. I'd just like to really quickly address the question on what individuals can do and how individuals can engage. And I think there's a lot of discussion right now on the counter speech strategy, right? But I think if there's something that in this very individual level can be done, that's the space for counter speech, right? I mean, there are limits to it, of course, and I think the panel has been addressing that somehow, that private policies, public policies are really important to address that, but there is value, great value in counter speech, especially if we take into consideration that online spaces are really important for women. If you talk to, I mean, any person who's involved in feminist activism understands, I think, the role of being able to be online, being able to campaign online. So I really think that the connection that Marwa was also making between freedoms and cyber violence, and how cyber violence affects freedoms, in fact, is really, really important for this discussion. And I think joining campaigns and driving discussion online is perhaps what's most at reach when it comes to the individual level.
Thanks so much, Mariana. So we have about 15 minutes left. Helen, I can see that your mic is off. Do you want to respond, or should we take the last two questions and then we can also embed the response in the closing remarks? Okay, great. So we have two questions in the Q&A. We have a question from Elizabeth Sutherland. I don't know if she's still available. Eve, do you want to unmute her and she can ask the question?
Yeah, I'm Elizabeth. I'm not seeing you on. Give me 1 second to try and pull it up. Okay, Elizabeth, can you say hello if you're there?
Hi, yeah, I think the unmute button worked. Thank you all for putting together this panel. This has been really informative, so thank you. Yeah, I had a question, so kind of on the Facebook front, you know, it's really great that, you know, we're connecting women with these resources to report their harassment and to kind of, you know, find the proper resources after experiencing it. But given that that process can still be so traumatic, you know, I'm really curious what kind of efforts these companies are going to before women get harassed to prevent that, you know, from occurring and to make these spaces safer, you know, kind of before the harm is done.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth.
So then the last question from Tara Hairston.
Tara, can you hear us? Can you say hello?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, great.
Awesome. Well, I want to echo what some of the other attendees have said. Really, really appreciative of everyone's time and putting this event together. It's such an important conversation. So thank you all for your expertise. My question kind of relates to the fact that we're focusing a lot, and obviously rightfully so, on kind of the content moderation piece. But I'm curious, working for a tech company myself, what recommendations would the panelists have with regards to kind of other aspects of technology that can be addressed in this conversation? You know, one of the questions that my company and others are struggling with is just how do we make sure that the products we may be developing are, you know, as kind of attuned to these issues and making sure that they cannot be abused in a way that perpetuates this online gender-based violence. So I'm just curious if there's any kind of best practices or other recommendations that you may have for the private sector that may not be in the content moderation space. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tara. So we have about 12 minutes left, and I would invite my panelists to also take this opportunity to respond if they have anything else to respond. I think, Cindy, there were some direct questions, and Helen, you had something you wanted to say, and also use this opportunity to offer some closing remarks as we wind down this panel.
Great.
So I'll start with you, Cindy.
Thank you. So to Elizabeth's question about what can we do to make sure that abuse is not even occurring on platforms so we don't have to worry about taking it down, there's a couple of things. One of the things that I'm excited about is we're using more and more machine learning and artificial intelligence to try to identify potential harmful content. One of the ways we do it is when people are typing a caption or a comment, they'll actually get a pop-up that says what you're about to post has been reported by other users as violating our community standards. Do you still want to post it? And what we found with that pop-up sort of friction, it works. A surprising number of people rethink what they're getting ready to post when that is brought to their attention, which the whole point here is we're trying to change culture so that it is not even fathomable that you would ever say something harassing, threatening, and misogynistic offline or online. We want to change that entire mindset. One of the other things that we're doing, especially with some of the coordinated attacks and the cyber mobbing, as a couple of people have mentioned, is using technology to look for those spikes and immediately investigate. So when something is starting to go viral or it looks like there's a pile-on attack, to get human intervention, and the technology can identify it and then flag it for teams to go in and look at it so that it isn't up to one individual victim to have to say, look, I'm being attacked by 100+ people. Ideally, we want to be able to catch that quickly and shut it down. I will say, though, that one of the ways that we feed that machine learning and the artificial intelligence is by people reporting things. So please, if you see harassing content, even if it's not directed towards you, please report it on any platform, on all the platforms, because it feeds into the artificial intelligence and will help our computers get better, because context matters. And if we don't have that contextual piece, it's really hard to action on it. And I'll pass to whoever wants to go next.
Thank you. I'll go next, and then I'll address this question and the one before. I think it was Tara. It's a very good question on how do we integrate gender in the innovation cycle. That's something that we have worked on at UN Women with a couple of companies to try to see how we can integrate gender in the design phase, in the pilot phase, when a new application or a new platform is launched, and afterwards. And it's complex. There's no silver bullet, I think, to develop technology that is safe from the get-go. But I think what's important is to, at least during the development phase, try to take as many steps as possible, try to have diverse teams, also test your technology on a diverse panel and on people coming from different countries, different regions, different contexts. I think it's very important to look at intersectionality, because it's bad enough to be a woman online, but if you're a woman of color or if you LGBTQ, you have much more aggressive behavior against you, and this is something to take into account. One thing I also used to say a lot to people, that you have to educate your team, especially your tech team, about gender, about social science. It's not the job of the one woman or the two women on the team to tell their colleagues what it is to be a woman or what is gender-based violence. Gender-based violence is something that everyone has to be aware of, and we all come with our own biases. And I think it's important that you address it not as a women issue, but something that the whole team is responsible for. And I will just also say a couple of words on the previous discussion. I think it's really important when we talk about regulation, legislation, policy, that we really have focus on prevention and on legal aspect and punishment together. It's not one or the other. I think it's important to have an ecosystem that is inclusive, and so that when you look at policies, you also look at what you can do for prevention, for changing social norms, for trying to educate bystanders, because it's as important as looking at policy and what works for policy level. And for policy, please keep in mind that you have to contextualize. Don't look at what the country next door is doing, because we all have different privacy law legislation, we all have different histories, and it's important that you contextualize with what works with your different authorities and make something that is efficient and works. So again, thank you. It was fantastic to be with this amazing group of women, and thanks.
Bhavna, Marwa, Mariana? Closing remarks?
Yeah, I can go ahead. So, I mean, perhaps I would just like to briefly just mention the issue of gender disinformation and how it spurs it on like news, on harassment, on biased AI or other interventions. And so from this remark, we can really conclude that it's just about like cultivating that herd immunity online. We really need it. And in this process, all stakeholders should work together, because even if we try to really build the awareness of the tech teams or of corporate or whatever, we would still need to really leverage that efforts together, because even if we work on the design, we would fail when it comes to moderating the online behavior. We would fail to fight this self-censorship online. And so I just believe that this sort of herd immunity is very much needed. And to do it, and as a simple starting point, we would need to bridge the conversation just like we did today. And these discussions are really rare, and but they're really needed. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Marwa. I'll take off from your last point about this being not only rare, but absolutely needed for us to have these conversations. And start off by responding to Tara's question about other aspects of technology. Broadly, a question about what sort of techno design measures can tech companies take. And I think it is absolutely vital for companies to do algorithmic audits before they launch into new areas. And these audits need to be sensitive to intersectionalities in cultures that they have, that they're going to be unleashing this technology into. And not doing this has had some devastating effects across nations, across the world, and has really hurt the social fabric of several societies and led to like death counts that can be directly notched up to these lapses. My second point is that yes, content moderation gets talked about a lot, but not enough. And it is very important for us to move beyond just speaking about voluntary agreements that ELA Santa Clara that tech companies can sort of sign off on, and move closer to something that because we've really been able to see how NetsDG and the having of NetsDG has led to a greater degree of accountability of social media platforms towards their responsiveness to a lot of to there's a greater degree of transparency in their reporting of content in Germany, and we'd like to see that across the world. And finally, we really need a global consensus around online civility, to echo what Nandini started off with. And we need to get all of us and everybody who recognizes the necessity of this conversation together until we have been able to create this consensus, and we're able to recognize not only that we need to there is a need to redesign, but we need to transcend conversations of safety of online spaces to making sure that online spaces are spaces of what Marwa called pleasure and consent, and towards that I raise my my hat figuratively.
I'd just like to say that I agree that we should speak more of moderation. And just as a last remark, closing remark, in that conversation of, let's say, policy versus individual action, I think one thing that's important to add to this conversation is that even when policy is at stake, culture drives its enforcement a lot. We've seen a lot of laws not being enforced or not being properly enforced because of how law enforcement agents see these issues. And there's a case in Brazil that's huge right now that sort of talks directly into that. So I think all these things are more connected than it may sound from some conversations that sort of drive like a very a distinction, a strong distinction. So yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you to everyone, for our panelists, for such an amazing conversation. I think we've all taken away some key points on how we can respond and how we can build up all of the work that we're doing. And I think you can find them all on different social media platforms and you can reach out to them. And thank you to our fantastic organizers and to our audience for being part of this conversation. We do hope to continue to engage with you on this work on trying to make the internet a safe space for everyone, in particular women and girls. Thanks everyone. Have a good day, evening, night, wherever you are.
All right, bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, bye.
Thank you.